When the French explorer Samuel de Champlain stepped into the dense, fertile heart of Ontario in the late summer of 1615, he did not plant a silk flag and unilaterally claim a savage wilderness for a European king. He stood before a towering, triple-walled wooden palisade that reached 35 feet into the sky, complete with defensive galleries and watchtowers. He walked into a heavily fortified, deeply entrenched city, housing thousands of indigenous people, took off his hat in a forced, diplomatic bow, and recognized a cold reality. The French were not conquerors. They were junior partners, asking for an alliance. We are fed a comfortable, highly sanitized, and entirely false narrative that Europeans arrived on the shores of North America and immediately dictated the terms of global trade through sheer technological supremacy. The reality is that for the first half of the 17th century, the entire French colonial economy was absolutely paralyzed without the explicit consent of a single, highly centralized indigenous banking system. They were the Wyandot. The French called them the Huron, and they did not just participate in the fur trade. They engineered it, monopolized it, and held the absolute logistical keys to the continent. History is never what you think. To understand the absolute geopolitical power of the Huron Confederacy, you have to look at the map of 17th-century North America, not as an empty, romanticized wilderness, but as a heavily guarded, heavily exploited economic zone. Huronia, or Wyandot, was a dense, highly populated peninsula in modern-day Ontario, strategically bordered by the deep waters of Georgian Bay and Lake Simcoe. It functioned as a natural geographical fortress, surrounded by water and dense timber. But the true power of the Huron did not come from hunting beaver in the woods. It came from the dirt. The Huron were a highly advanced agrarian society, operating on an industrial scale. While European cities of the era were drowning in their own filth and starving through the winters, the Huron had engineered 18 massive, organized towns. They cleared tens of thousands of acres of ancient forest to plant vast, mathematically precise fields of corn, beans, and squash. This agricultural machine was so massive that it consumed its own environment. Every 15 to 20 years, the Huron would systematically deplete the nitrogen in the soil, exhaust the surrounding timber required for firewood, and outlast the structural integrity of their wooden palisades and longhouses, which would begin to rot. When that happened, they did not starve. They executed a massive, highly organized civic migration, abandoning the rotting timber and relocating entire cities miles away to fresh soil. In the brutal, unforgiving economy of the northern frontier, corn was not just a food source, it was fiat currency. The nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes of the frozen north, the Algonquin, the Innu, and the Nipissing, could not farm in the frozen granite of the Canadian Shield. They possessed premium, thick winter furs, but they constantly lived on the razor's edge of starvation. The Huron exploited this biological vulnerability with absolute, calculating precision. They produced massive caloric surpluses, storing millions of bushels of dried corn in giant cedar vats inside their fortified longhouses. They traded this excess carbohydrate wealth to the starving northern tribes in exchange for high-grade beaver pelts. The Huron essentially operated as the central bank of the Great Lakes. They hoarded the corn, strictly controlled the exchange rates, and funneled the continental wealth directly into their palisaded cities. When the French established their struggling, freezing colonial outposts along the St. Lawrence River at Quebec, they quickly realized a grim reality. They were completely locked out of the continental interior. They did not conquer the Huron. They submitted to their trade monopoly. The French essentially became the geopolitical vassals of the Huron trade empire. The Huron explicitly forbade the French from bypassing their territory to to trade directly with the northern tribes. If the French wanted a single beaver pelt to ship back to the luxury hat markets of Paris, they had to buy it exclusively through Huron middlemen, at prices dictated entirely by Huron chiefs. The Huron did not trust European paper contracts, and they did not care about the distant authority of the French king. They demanded human collateral. They forced the French to send their young men, the famous coureurs des bois, like Etienne Brulé, to live in Huron longhouses. These Frenchmen were forced to learn the incredibly complex Wendat language, which became the absolute lingua franca of North American trade, and assimilate into indigenous culture just to maintain the alliance. Furthermore, the Huron forced the French military into a strict kinetic contract. If the French wanted the logistics routes to remain open, they had to bleed for them. In 1609, Champlain and his musketeers were obligated to serve as heavy infantry and military advisors in the Hurons' ancient, ongoing territorial wars. Champlain was forced to march south to Lake Champlain and execute opposing chiefs with his matchlock arquebus. He sparked a multi-generational blood feud with the Iroquois Confederacy, entirely to pay the political toll required to secure his commercial lease with the Huron. By the 1630s, the scale of the Huron operation was staggering. It was the premier logistics corporation of the New World, and it ran on sheer human endurance. Every spring, when the river ice finally shattered, a massive, highly synchronized fleet of hundreds of Huron birch-bark canoes would depart Georgian Bay. They descended the brutal, 800-mile gauntlet of the French, Mattawa, and Ottawa rivers. This was not a leisurely paddle. The route contained over 50 lethal rapids. When the water was too violent, the Huron executed portages. Heavily muscled paddlers would beach their canoes, strap 90-pound packs of pelts to their heads, using leather tumplines, and run barefoot over jagged granite and through mosquito-choked swamps, carrying the heavy birch-bark canoes on their shoulders. They did this while heavily armed, guarding their multi-million-franc convoys against ambushes. But monopolies breed desperate enemies. By strictly controlling the flow of northern furs to the French and southern corn to the north, the Huron completely isolated the Iroquois Confederacy, located in modern-day upstate New York. The Iroquois had exhausted the beaver populations in their own territories. To survive the new, globalized economy and purchase European steel, they desperately needed access to the northern hunting grounds. But the Huron blockaded the waterways, violently refusing to let the Iroquois participate in the French trade network. The Iroquois were trapped in an economic desert. They were faced with a grim, existential calculus: break the Huron monopoly, or face total economic and demographic collapse. The military dynamics of the continent shifted violently, not because of tactics, but because of competing European trade policies. When the Dutch established Fort Orange, modern-day Albany, New York, they operated as pure capitalists. They did not care about saving souls or spreading religion. They recognized the strategic value of the Iroquois and began trading high-quality flintlock muskets, lead, and massive kegs of black powder directly to the Mohawk and Seneca in massive quantities. The French, conversely, severely restricted their weapons trade. The Jesuit priests, the Black Robes, operating in Huronia, were given absolute veto power over who received French guns. They rigidly refused to arm any indigenous person unless they officially converted to Catholicism. This disastrous European policy fatally divided the Huron nation. It fractured their internal unity, creating bitter, violent schisms between Christian converts, who held the guns, and traditionalists, who held the political legitimacy. Worse, it left the vast majority of the Huron heavy infantry armed only with wooden slat armor and stone-tipped arrows against Iroquois lead. The ballistic arms race had tipped. and the Huron were already bleeding out from an invisible enemy. Between 1634 and 1640, devastating waves of European smallpox swept through Huronia. The virus performed a targeted demographic eradication, slashing a thriving population of nearly 40,000 people down to barely 10,000. It systematically killed the elders who held the diplomatic knowledge and the veteran military commanders who understood how to defend the palisades. What followed was not a primitive tribal skirmish. It was a hostile corporate takeover, executed through total, systematic liquidation upon a crippled nation. In the brutal winter of 1648 to 1649, the Iroquois broke every established rule of indigenous warfare. Traditionally, kinetic campaigns were conducted in the summer, when logistics were manageable. But a massive, heavily armed Iroquois strike force of over 1,000 veteran warriors marched north on snowshoes through the deep, freezing drifts of the Ontario winter. They bypassed the usual border skirmishes and struck directly at the heart of the Huron infrastructure. Before dawn on March 16, 1649, they breached the massive wooden walls of the fortified towns of Tainhatan-Taron, St. Ignace, and St. Louis. The Iroquois did not just kill the warriors, they executed a total logistical erasure. They burned the massive storehouses of corn, destroyed the agricultural infrastructure, and shattered the central economic nodes of the empire. They also targeted the European management. They captured the French Jesuit priests, Jean de Brébeuf and Gabriel Lalemant, to send a clear message that the French God could not protect the Huron supply lines. The Iroquois subjected the priests to horrific, calculated torture. They mocked the Catholic sacrament of baptism by pouring boiling water over Brébeuf's head and placed collars of red-hot iron axes around their necks before finally burning them at the stake. The psychological and kinetic shock was absolute. Within a matter of weeks, the remnants of a confederacy that had once controlled the wealth of a continent ceased to exist as a sovereign entity. The survivors burned their own remaining 15 villages to deny the infrastructure and food to the enemy, and scattered into the freezing wilderness. The immediate aftermath was a demographic nightmare. Thousands of Huron refugees fled to Gahohendo, Christian Island, in Georgian Bay, attempting to build a new fortress alongside the surviving French priests. But they had no corn. The Iroquois had burned the agrarian bank. In the freezing winter of 1649 to 1650, the island turned into a starvation camp. Without their massive caloric surpluses, over 3,000 Huron died of malnutrition and exposure in a single season. The island was littered with unburied bodies. The survivors realized that remaining in their homeland was a death sentence. They abandoned the island and fled westward, across the freezing waters of Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, carrying the institutional knowledge of the greatest trade network the continent had ever seen. They reformed, reorganized, and became known as the Wyandot. Though their demographics were shattered, their diplomatic prestige remained deeply intact. When they integrated with the Council of Three Fires, the Odawa, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe, the Wyandot became the elder statesmen of the new Western resistance. Because of their ancient legacy as the original masters of the trade, they were granted the immense honor of being the keepers of the council fire for the Western tribes at the strategic choke point of Detroit. They taught the Western tribes the fatal lessons of 1649. Never trust European military promises. Never let religious zealots divide your political infrastructure. And never let an enemy monopolize firearms. The Huron survivors transformed their logistical brilliance into diplomatic leverage. They became the political glue that helped unite the Great Lakes tribes, ultimately forging the very coalition that would, decades later, finally halt the Iroquois war machine in its tracks and push them back to New York. The frontier was never a wild, chaotic void waiting to be tamed by European civilization. It was a highly structured, ruthless economic arena. The Huron built an agrarian bank that dictated the survival of a European colony, only to be violently liquidated when the supply chain of gunpowder shifted against them. When the fires of 1649 burned out, the keys to North America were left in the ashes, waiting for the next syndicate to claim them.